Okay, can everybody see the screen okay?
You're good, Lexi.
All right.
All right, so we are just going to introduce ourselves a little bit. So we are both AmeriCorps members, and we're part of Eco AmeriCorps, which is essentially different service positions throughout organizations, government positions, et cetera, throughout the state of Vermont, serving in different areas of environmental stewardship. There's, I think, about 25 of us throughout the state. And we are two of them that are serving with solid waste management districts. I am Amanda Clement. I'm serving with the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District, which is the one that's centered around Montpelier. There's 19 member towns as part of our district. And me personally, I also have a BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science from Castleton University. And I took the Master Composter course, but before that, I really knew very little about composting. So I think composting for everyone is kind of a learning. You learn more about it over time. So Lexi is going to introduce herself.
All right, so hello everyone. I am Lexi Chambers. I'm the Eco AmeriCorps member for the Lamoille Regional Solid Waste Management District. A little bit of background about me. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I got my BS in geology from Slippery Rock University. And to be honest, I was in the same boat as Amanda before serving. I hadn't really had much hands-on experience with compost. And I've been implemented a lot at our composting facility, Lamoille Soil, that the district owns, and absolutely fell in love with compost. Love learning about it, love teaching people about it. I also got my Master Composter certification as well as my Compost Operator certification for Vermont. So I am very excited to dive right in with you guys, and hopefully we all learn something. All right, so what is compost? Compost is the return of organic materials to a rich, stable, humus-like material through a managed oxidative process that is mediated by micrometabolism. And you will find that there are a lot of different definitions for what compost is online. This so far has been my favorite one that I found in Community Scale Composting Systems by James McSweeney. It seems to combine all of my favorite parts of other definitions into it. And then on the left here, you can see a photo. Sorry, I have to move a bar. You can see a photo of a healthy compost pile, and there's some steam coming off of it. So compost essentially builds healthy soils. All right, so for this presentation specifically, I wanted to go into the difference between natural decomposition and composting. So compost essentially happens with or without us. Organic matter will always break down over time. Leaves will fall onto a forest floor and decay. Trees will fall and are broken down by decomposers and fungi. So like I said, compost will happen with or without us, and it is the process of organic matter naturally decaying in a forest setting to make fertile soil. Whenever humans compost, though, we are managing the biological decomposition process to create an ideal environment for microorganisms to thrive in order to utilize compost as a soil amendment. So now we want to get into why we compost and why it's important. So the benefits of compost. First and foremost, it keeps food waste out of the landfill, which is important for two big reasons. The first one is that it lowers methane emissions, because whenever we put organic waste into a landfill, essentially what we're doing is we're sending it to a giant hole in the ground that is lined with a plastic bag, which creates an anaerobic environment. And whenever organic matter breaks down in this environment, it releases methane. And that is a greenhouse gas that is up to 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And then the second reason for keeping food waste out of the landfill is that food waste in organic matter has nutrients that can be recircled into the environment again whenever we make compost. So compost also increases organic matter in soil by bettering soil health and increasing water retention in soil. It reduces the need for chemical fertilizers by providing soil with microbes that make nutrients more available to plants. And it can help plants sequester carbon into the soil. And whenever we say sequester carbon, that means that the plants are getting aid from compost to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the earth. Okay, so now I just want to introduce you to the little microorganisms and insects that live within a compost pile, because healthy compost piles are teeming with life, and they're are the microbes, which are the bacteria. I know that the word bacteria sometimes can carry a bit of a negative stigma, but these are all really good bacteria that are working really hard to break down our food scraps. So they're the hardest workers within a pile, and they make up about 90% of the microorganisms within each pile. The other 10% are fungi, molds, and yeasts, and then they work alongside a myriad of other living beings like spiders, ants, centipedes, and slugs. So now I'm going to get into a bit of the nitty gritty of compost and the science behind it. So it might feel like I'm throwing a lot of information at you at once, but don't worry, we're going to have a Q&A section after the next 4 slides to answer any questions that you have about this section of the PowerPoint. So I like to think of compost as being a living being, just like you have to give feed and water to your animals or your plants or yourself, you also have to do that with compost. Sorry, I just got a notification of something. So first and foremost, our compost pile needs food, and food for compost comes in the form of nitrogen and carbon. Nitrogen helps cell growth and cell function in the microorganisms, and carbon provides energy for the microorganisms to break down their food. So whenever we're talking in compost terms, you'll hear them being called the greens and the browns. And all that that means is that greens are nitrogen-rich sources and browns are carbon-rich sources. So nitrogen-rich sources can be food scraps, grass clippings, coffee filters, hair for fresh leaves or tea leaves. Carbon sources can be dried leaves, wood shavings, straw, twigs, cardboard, shredded newspaper, and sawdust. So whenever you are creating your compost pile, you're kind of building your own recipe on what you have available to you and what is sustainable. So you don't need to go and seek out shredded newspaper if you don't have any shredded newspaper, and you don't need to have hair or fur in your compost pile. You're kind of picking and choosing from these lists and creating a recipe. The most important part about the recipe and the food inputs for your pile is that you keep them in the ideal ratio of 3:1. So you want your pile to be 25% by volume nitrogen rich sources and 75% by volume of carbon rich sources. So now we're going to talk about water and moisture. So your pile needs to be kept at an ideal moisture in order for it to compost efficiently. And a lot of the moisture that you get from your pile is going to come from your nitrogen sources. Food scraps are pretty dense, they're pretty wet already to start with. It is important to keep a hose nearby your compost pile in case you do need to irrigate it, but very rarely will you have to do that. So whenever you are testing the moisture of your pile, you want to perform what we call a squeeze test. That means that you just reach into your pile 1 to 2 feet, depending on the size of it, and pull out a ball of compost with a glove or ungloved hand, depending on what you're comfortable with, and squeeze it in your hand. And what you want is for it to drip just a couple drips down your fist or have like a glisten of compost juice on your hands whenever you open your hand up, and it should form a little ball. If you open up your hand and the compost just falls apart, your compost is too dry. And then if you squeeze your hand and you get drips and drips of compost leaking down your arm, it's too wet. And this is important to keep it at an ideal moisture level because microbial activity will slow down or cease if your pile is too wet or too dry, and your pile can get really smelly too. So next we're going to talk about air and more specifically oxygen, and that's because the bacteria that live within the compost pile are aerobic and they need oxygen and they love oxygen and they need it to survive. So it's important that we pump air into our compost piles. At the facility that I work at, we use aerated static piles, which is an ASP pile. So we use fans to put air into our piles. But if you're backyard composting, you can use something like a pitchfork or a compost auger or other specialized compost tools. And all that you have to do is go into your pile and fluff it up. So it's important to have pore space in our air or pore space in our compost piles, because if they get too dense, they're going to start to smell really bad. Okay, so next is temperature. So just like we need to be kept at an ideal temperature to function and to survive, so do our little microbe friends. So compost piles should be about 135 to 160 degrees when actively composting. Your backyard piles probably aren't going to get up to 160, but they will probably stay around the 140 range while actively composting. And this is important because if temperatures get too hot or too cold, we can kill off all the healthy bacteria that exist within piles. So you can see on the photo on the left here, there was snow on top of this pile. I think I took this picture in December or January in Vermont. So there was a lot of snow and that pile was still about 140 degrees. Okay, here is a video of a healthy compost pile. This is one of my golden children up at Lamoille Soil. If I can get it to play. Okay, so that's what it should look like whenever you do a squeeze test. And whenever you do it, if it's at the ideal temperature, it will steam and it might feel really hot in your hand. So that's why sometimes I recommend using a gloved hand whenever you're doing a squeeze test. Okay, so now we're going to take a quick break and take any questions on that information that you have been presented so far.
So we have a question in the chat, and I turned my video off because I was having some bandwidth issues. So that's why I don't have a video on. So the first question we have right now is, how often should you aerate if you are doing it manually?
So if you're doing it with a pitchfork or like an auger or something, I would say do it maybe once every 2 weeks. Aerating will start to activate your pile again. So once you flip it or turn it, as we say, you will see that it'll heat up again after aerating it. It's also important, we're going to get into troubleshooting a little bit later, but if you're noticing that your pile is too dense or too wet, that's a good time to aerate it too. I didn't know if you had anything to add, Amanda.
No, I just, stirring your pile isn't going to hurt it. So,
Right.
I would say more rather than less.
Great, thanks. So the next question is, what foods should you not use in your compost pile?
So Amanda's going to talk about this a little bit later. Amanda, do you want to just touch on it now?
Yeah, so the big one that we always say, especially if you're backyard composting and you're doing passive or cold composting, is you don't want to be adding any meat or bones. They're just not going to break down properly and they're going to cause all sorts of pest issues and they're going to smell. Other than that, it kind of is up to you. I mean, if you use large amounts of dairy, sometimes that smells. There's been some issues with like citrus peels over the years, but overall those should be fine. Pet waste, you don't want to be putting pet waste in there. There's all sorts of nasty microbes in there. But I think those are the main ones. If there's any other ones you want to touch on, Lexi.
No, those are really the big ones. Meat and bones and dairy a lot of the time is what we tell people to keep out of their backyard bins. But otherwise, kind of everything that is food scraps is fair game. Any fruits or veggies, coffee grinds, tea leaves, those are all really good things to put in your pile and good sources of nitrogen for your pile.
Thank you both. The next question is, will you talk about containers, or do you even need a container?
We're going to talk about that the entirety of the next section. So
stay tuned.
Okay, the next question is, on a larger / municipal scale, do you ever have needs for more carbon or nitrogen?
So where I work now at a commercial facility, we don't really have needs for more because we have a pretty good input right now of both carbon and nitrogen sources, because in Vermont we have a ban on food scraps in the landfill. So all of our residents' food scraps, which is about 15,000 residents, I'm not sure of the portion that come directly to our facility, but they bring all of their food scraps to us. And then in terms of carbon sources, we're pretty good with finding wood chip and sawdust. So we don't have much of a need for it, but we're not going to say no to getting more.
Great. The next question is, does a compost pile attract bears? I have a lot in my area.
So we're going to talk about this too in our troubleshooting, but to give you a summary, if you do compost correctly and you cover your compost bin in something like hardware cloth, which we'll talk about, you shouldn't have any problems with bears.
Great. The next question is, in the large scale that you are doing it in Vermont, are there any non-typical industrial browns that have to be added to unhealthy piles, like man-made digesters / bacterium mixes?
So for the facility that I'm at, we have not had to use any of those. We use 4 main carbon sources, which are hay, wood chip, sawdust, and then we use something called saw chip, which is just the medium between wood chip and sawdust. And we have not had to use anything other than that as our carbon sources. And sometimes we do add in like shredded paper or leaves if someone drops them off to us, but other than that, we have not had to use any man-made. Nope.
Great. And the next, well, that's not a question, it's more of a comment. but I agree with it. Check veggie, fruit peels, and scraps, but those little barcode stickers from the store,
Yes.
yeah, those don't break down, so those are good to take off before you put
Yeah,
them
but
in.
you want to make sure that you're checking all of your stuff for anything that's not organic because it's just not going to break down. So yeah.
Yeah, and we always say that PLUs give compost the blues. So those little PLU stickers is, yeah, that's something that we definitely don't want in our piles. And they do pop up a lot and I have to pick them out all the time. So yes, it's good practice to always just peel them off. All right, is that all the questions for now?
Yeah, actually, real quick, one more. Will banana peels break down?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Great. So there will be time for more questions later on in the presentation. So I think now is a good point to resume, Amanda.
Sounds good. All right, so now this is the whole section that we're going to talk a little bit about, well, quite a bit about how you can start composting in your own backyard. So the first off is what not to do. So the big one is that we have webinars a lot in my district, and a couple times we've gotten asked pretty much every webinar, you know, all of these things are organic. Can I just chuck them in my backyard and they'll break down? And the answer is not really the right way. So if you're just going to throw your food scraps loose in your backyard or just in a big pile or something like that, they're going to attract all sorts of pests. They're going to smell really bad. It's just not a good idea. And then along with that is open compost piles. So open compost piles, which is just when you do it on the ground in a pile without a container, is a totally valid way to compost. It's going to work. But the problem is it can really pose a hazard to, you know, the people and the pets and the wildlife that might be around your compost pile in your backyard. So when your compost pile is breaking down, it's going to have all sorts of molds in it and different toxins. And if, you know, a neighborhood dog comes along and wants to snack on it or something like that, it can actually kill them. And there has been cases where dogs have gotten really sick and died because they've found a compost pile, which is kind of sad. So we say that at least put a fence around your compost pile, but it's much better, especially if you're in a kind of urban area, to put it in some sort of container. And then open compost piles can also attract pests a little bit more. And then the big one, like I said earlier, is you don't want to be adding any meat or bones to your compost pile if you're doing it at home. If you're, you know, you're bringing it to a commercial facility and they can do hot composting and get it up to that ideal temperature, like Lexi said, that's different. But if you're doing it in your own backyard, meat and bones can almost, they just really smell, and they can actually kind of smell like, you know, something's dying. So you really want to keep them out of your compost pile. All right, we're going to move on to when you're setting up your compost pile. So we want you to think about your backyard. So, or whatever space you're going to put your compost pile in. So do you have a lot of sun or sun? Do you have a lot of shade? Is, you know, your whole lawn covered with, like, you know, beautiful trees, and you can't really, there's not a whole lot of big sunny spots, or, you know, it's a little hilly and some of the parts of it aren't accessible. You want to think about what you have available to you, and also the time and effort that you can spend on your composting. Because every different method is going to be a little bit different. Some of them are a little bit more labor intensive, some of them are less labor intensive, and it all is up to you and what you can do and what you are able to handle in your what you have available to you. So first up, sun or shade. Should you put your composter in the sun or should you put it in the shade? So overall, moderate sunlight is best. You don't really want as much full sunlight as you can get, unless you're using a green cone. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, which is called a solar digester, which will really only work totally correctly in full sunlight. But the sunlight will work and it'll be good, but it will dry out your compost pile, and that means that you're going to have to water it a lot more. It might kind of speed up the composting process a little bit, but it's going to dry it out, and you might have to water it a lot more regularly. If it's in the shade, it means that it might get a little bit more wet and the microbial activity might slow down a little bit. So if you can possibly put it in kind of moderate sunlight, that's best, but most composters will work in most conditions. And then accessibility. So where do you want to place it? A lot of times people will place them in their gardens, like you'll see in the green cones in the bottom picture. Those are green cones, and actually they'll actually emit nutrients out into the soil around them. So they're really great for putting in like your garden bed, but you can really put it anywhere that's best for you. But think about, you know, if you're going to put it on the edge of your property, are you going to be able to walk out there in the winter and add food scraps to it? Or are you not going to be able to do that? You're going to have to find another option for the winter. Maybe you don't want to put it too close to your house because you might have some sort of pest problem and you don't want them to be able to find other areas where they can get in trouble. And then you want to make sure that there's some sort of water source when you're by, like a hose or something, in case you need to top up that moisture. And then also think about the space that you have. So maybe you don't want to put it in a really tight spot because you're probably going to want a bin to put all your carbons in. You might want to expand in the future and maybe add another compost bin or another type of composter. So think about the space that you have and really consider it before you put your composter in. All right, now we're going to move on to different methods. So the first one is the one bin system, which is probably the most common because it's essentially an open composter pile that you're putting into a bin. So the good things about these is they're really easy to set up. Overall, even if you're building them, they're pretty accessible because it's essentially a box, right? So there's all sorts of different plans online that'll tell you how to do it. I've seen people build them out of pallets. I've seen people do it with trash cans. There's lots of different ways to create a compost bin, and there's lots of commercial options as well. So the top one right there, that's called a soil saver. And you can actually get these through a lot of different municipalities for like a decreased cost. I do want to mention with that you see the soil coming out of the bottom and it's like really fine black compost. Your compost is never going to look like that when it comes out of your composter initially. Your compost can look like that, but you're going to have to sift it. It's not going to just flow out of the bottom of your soil saver like a river. It's just not going to happen. But they're really good and really common options. And there's lots of different ones that you can build for really affordable rates. And they're enclosed and they're neat looking. And that means that if you're in an urban area that, you know, it's very unlikely that your neighbor's going to complain, you know, that your compost bin, it looks terrible or like smells or something like that. I mean, not smells, we're going to go over that later, but some of the cons of them is it can be kind of difficult to turn because you got to get a pitchfork in there or a shovel and fluff it up and get it around, and there's a limited volume. So a lot of people will have one compost bin and they'll have it for adding food scraps, and then they'll have another one for the curing process. A lot of times people need to expand and they're not ideal for the winter, which most compost systems are not ideal for the winter, especially in an area like Vermont where it gets very, very cold during the winter. They're going to freeze. That doesn't mean that you can't add things to them over the winter. Just continue to add those browns as well, but it is going to pile up, and then in the spring again the composting process will start and it'll be fine. But that's just some things to consider. So if you are going to expand, you might want to consider a multi-bin system. So a multi-bin system is essentially several different compost bins next to each other. So the one up in the top there, that's a 3-bin system. A lot of times 3-bin systems are great for people that maybe live in a multi-unit housing area where there's multiple families, or maybe a community compost site, or if you're, you know, have a farm or something and you're using a lot of different organics, that might be a good system for you just because there's a lot of space. So if it's just you and, you know, a couple people in your household or a single family, that might not be the best option for you. But a lot of times people will use like one bin to add your food scraps to continuously, one for the curing process, and then one for their finished compost that they can put on their garden and such. And then 2 bins, that's just a smaller version of it. And that's really best suited for single families or just a few families, and it just gives you less space. And you could use one of the bins to hold your carbons, or you can have it in a trash can next to it, like you can see in that 2-bin system. It's really whatever's going to work best for you and the way that you're managing your food scraps. All right, so we're going to move on. So this is just kind of highlighting how you're going to build your compost bin up. So this is really to really highlight that every time you want to add any sort of food scraps or greens, you want to add browns. So if you're, you might want to start off with like a layer of wood chips or something like that. for the bottom, and that will help keep it aerated. And then you can add your greens, and then your browns, and then your greens, and then your browns. However, I want to be clear that this is not exactly what it's going to look like if you're going to slice your compost bin in half, because you want to get in there and stir. So it's going to be mixed up in there, but this is to highlight that, you know, if you're going to take a bucket of food scraps, every time you do a bucket of food scraps, you want to do 3 buckets of browns. So you want to like 3 buckets of wood shavings or dried leaves or something like that, just to keep that ratio up. And then you want to make sure that there's no food showing on the surface. So when you're building your compost bin up, every time you've stirred it up, top it off with a layer of brown so that it's covered. All right, now moving on. So tumblers. So tumblers are a really common option. A lot of people get them because they seem really easy, right? Like, you know, you don't really have to get in there with a pitchfork and turn it around. You can spin it and it's going to turn itself. They generate heat pretty quickly. And they're fully enclosed, which means that you're going to get a lot less pet problems. But there are some issues with tumblers. For instance, you really only have that enclosed space inside the tumbler. It's just the, you know, the tumbler. It's not like you can expand from it. So they tend to fill up really quickly. And they might attract less microbes. So we always tell people that if you're using a tumbler, you want to inoculate it, which is essentially you want to take a spoonful of either finished compost or some soil and take a shovelful and pop it in there, and that'll add some microbes to your tumbler before you start using it, so that you're not having the issues where things aren't breaking down because there's not enough microbes in there. And then browns can be really important. These tend to get wet sometimes. So if it gets wet, you want to be adding some browns. If it gets dry, you want to be adding some water. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in troubleshooting. And these can freeze in the winter, and it can be really impossible to get in there and work with it. And we've had a lot of people talk about in our winter composting webinar that we do, that like the latches will freeze on theirs and then they can't access them at all. The best option if you want to use a tumbler is a Jora, which is that green one on the top. And that's just a really heavily insulated tumbler, and it has 2 different compartments. And we've had have had people have a lot of luck with those. But if you're using a tumbler, it's really best paired with a bin. So you could get your compost started in the tumbler. And then when it starts breaking down and it's looking good, your tumbler fills up, you can dump it into a bin and move it on. And then, you know, it's a good Kickstarter for it. All right, and the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about vermicomposting. So you could do a whole webinar on vermicomposting, but this is just a different option, especially if you want to be composting throughout the entire winter, year round, and you have maybe a really small space like an apartment or something like that with only a couple people. This can be a really kind of fun, interactive, and efficient way to break down your food scraps. So when you're vermicomposting, you want to use, there's a couple different types of worms you can use, but the most common ones are called red wigglers, and you can get them really easily online. And they're the ones that you're going to break down your food scraps the best. And you can build your own bin. You can, typically they're built out of like 2 different little plastic tubs, like you can see in the bottom there, typically with some holes drilled in there for drainage and aeration. And you're going to use bedding material that is normally shredded up newspaper. But the biggest thing you want to realize with vermicomposting is that it's an animal. So it's a living thing that is taking care of your food scraps. And because of that, there's some things that can go wrong because you can kill your worms. So you want to make sure that you're not overfeeding them. So you might get really, excited that you've got these worms and you're gonna, feed them, and you're putting in tons of food scraps every day, and they just can't handle that. You're gonna get a good sense over time of what they're gonna be able to handle, but you wanna make sure you're not overfeeding them. And then there's also a very long list of things that you shouldn't be giving your worms, like spicy foods or things that are too acidic, because they're just not good for the worm's diet. And they need regular moisture. You need to make sure that they're keeping moist and watered, keep them out of direct sunlight, because they will actually kind of go towards the bottom if they have sunlight, because they want to stay away from the sun because they don't want to dry out. And then also there's some hands-on maintenance required. There's actually the most common method of getting your compost and worm castings, which is actually the worms poop out of there to use as fertilizer, is called the dump and sort method, which is that you just dump it all out and you create little piles. So if you're a little squeamish around things like worms, it's probably not the best method for you. But I think this is really fun. I've always wanted to vermicompost, but this is just one of the types of animals that can actually help you break down your food scraps. Lots of people use chickens. Some people feed them to pigs. There's lots of different options, but we thought this was a good one to include. All right, and then we're going to talk briefly about the green cone. So the green cone is not a composter, but it's a really good and really hands-off method of breaking down your food scraps. So a green cone is called a solar digester, and that's because it uses the heat of the sun to break down your food scraps. So essentially what it is it's a black plastic cone and it's a green plastic cone. You see there, and then it has a basket that goes under the ground. And that's where your food scraps are going to end up when you put them in the top. And they break down over time. And the good thing about a green cone is that it can really handle pretty much any food waste that you want to put in it. You can put meat and bones in a green cone, which is a great thing because like composters, we tell people all the time not to add meat and bones or a lot of dairy, and the green cone can handle all of it. So a lot of times people will have composters and then maybe they'll get a green cone because they want to manage their meat and bone scraps at home, but they can't compost them at home and they don't want to go out and drop them off somewhere. And green cones don't need any browns because they're not a composter, very little maintenance. The biggest thing with a green cone is that you want to make sure you're putting it in the right area. So it really needs as much sunlight as you can possibly put it in, and you need to make sure that your soil drains really well. So dump a bucket of, dig your hole to put your basket in, and then dump a bucket of water in there and make sure that it drains well, that it's not like pooling up, because that means it's not going to break down correctly. And then one thing to realize about these is they can be a little bit expensive, but a lot of times local municipalities, like your local solid waste management district, sometimes will sell them to you for a really reduced rate. All right, now Lexi's going to talk about troubleshooting.
All right, so I'm just going to touch quickly on troubleshooting your compost pile because we get a lot of concerns about a pile being too smelly, too wet, or afraid that we're going to have bears or raccoons attack our compost piles. But these are, they are legit concerns and they are valid concerns to have, but don't let it stop you from wanting the compost because they can be fixed pretty easily. So first, let's say that your pile is not heating correctly, it's having a strange odor, or it's too wet. So always go back to your recipe and check your recipe. Make sure that you have a 3-to-1 ratio of greens to browns. If anything, you can always add more carbon into your pile. It's not going to hurt it to add more carbon, other than it might just get a little bit too dry at that point. So after you've checked your recipe, you can also go back to turning the pile. Like I said before, turning the pile will help with wetness. It'll help if your pile is too dense. And then you can also utilize an activator like chicken or cow manure if your pile is too cold. And then in terms of animals, use hardware cloth around your bins or around the basket of your green cone because they hate the way that it feels on their claws or on their paws. So if they know that you have that hardware cloth around your bin, chances are they aren't going to bother it. They might come up and smell it, but chances are they're not going to go in there and totally destroy your compost pile. And then another thing that is important to do is to leave your food scraps covered. Make sure that they're never exposed because animals are curious and they might smell something that was in your green cone, or they might smell cheese if you put cheese in your pile, and they're going to come up and they're going to want to check it out. But if you cover your nitrogen sources or your greens with browns, you shouldn't have a problem with animals coming up and wanting to check out your pile. So now we're going to transition into commercial and community composting. Excuse me. So say that backyard composting is not for you and vermicomposting is not for you, whether that be you don't have the space for it or you don't have the time for it. There are other options for managing your food scraps. So first, you could take it to a drop-off. So places like local farms, commercial compost facilities, community gardens and compost sites, transfer stations, and your neighbors all accept food scraps. In Vermont, we have a lot of different options. All of these are options where I live to take your food scraps. And then you can see in the photos an example of a community composting system on the bottom, and then on the top is an example of a drop-off site for grow compost. And that is just where you take, say, your 5-gallon bucket or your freezer bag of food scraps, and you pour it into these totes. And then this location will work as a middleman, and then the totes will get carried somewhere else and be composted. So you can also choose to get your food scraps picked up in a lot of areas. So some hauling services will offer pickup of food scraps for a small fee, and they're commonly taken back to a farm or a larger composting operation like the one that I work at, or Black Dirt Farm in Vermont, if anyone is familiar with that. They take it back and feed it to their chickens. And it's important to check with each individual hauler for items that they accept, because some haulers will not accept items like compostable plastics, whether that be a compostable plastic bag or biodegradable cutlery. Then you can see some photos of Grow Compost, Earth Girl Composting, and Music Mountain Compost Pickup. And either they'll give you a 5-gallon bucket, and then they'll come and pick it up once a week and switch it out with a clean bucket, or you'll have a tote at like your apartment building or something where you will dump your food scraps in, and then they'll come and pick up the tote once a week or once every 2 weeks.
All right. We're just going to wrap this off talking about some kind of specifics in legislation and kind of the things around that. So in Vermont, we have Act 148, which is the universal recycling law here. And it was passed by the legislature in Vermont unanimously in 2012, and then through stages began being enacted through different landfill bans on things like recycling and leaf and yard waste, and all sorts of different types of things that you are no longer allowed to put in the landfill. But it kind of ended with the food scrap ban for all residents on July 1st of last year. So composting and food scraps have become really big topics here in Vermont because of that. But we just wanted to mention that since not everyone will be from Vermont, or maybe not everyone's from Vermont, or just to kind of give you some insight, is that all sorts of different solid waste management regulations are really done mostly at the state and local level, not necessarily the federal. So that means that wherever you live, it might be a little bit different than different areas of the country. So there's a map over there that gives some different colors for different states, and this is where there's different organics bans throughout the country. So the ones in green are ones where leaf and yard waste is landfill banned, so you can't bring like your leaves or your yard debris when you're like cleaning up your lawn, or like loose grass and that kind of stuff. You can't bring that to the landfill. That's landfill banned. And the ones that are in the stripy green ones, those are where they're banned for ones that don't have any sort of landfill gas collection. And then the ones that are in orange are the only ones that have different food scrap regulations. And this isn't necessarily the entire state. Some of them, it's only different cities that have food scrap bans. But that's just something to think about, because there's different laws throughout the country. That means that there's different availability to the different food scrap diversion services like Lexi was talking about. So you might not have as many options for farms that will take your food scraps, or for different pickup services or stuff like that. So if you're really looking to do that, what you want to do is you want to contact your local municipalities or whoever really manages your solid waste. So that's different depending on where you are in the country. So in Vermont, we have solid waste management districts, and that's where you can get a lot of information about solid waste management. And they can give you a lot of tips and point you in the right direction of where you want to compost. Some of them even hold their own composting. But it's not necessarily the same thing throughout the country. So I believe in New Hampshire, it's a little bit more locally managed, more by different towns. But I am most knowledgeable in Vermont, so don't quote me on that, but it's very different throughout the entire country. And we're optimistic that over the years, there's going to be more legislation and more people are going to move towards diverting different organics in the landfill, because it really does cut down on the emissions that come from landfills, and is also bringing these valuable resources to a point where they are actually used. And if you want to figure out if there is a pickup option near you, there's a website that we found, that's that one on the bottom, litterless.com, and that gives some different options actually throughout the entire country. But you might need to actually look around yourself to see where the best options are for you. So you might need to find out where your local community garden is, or talk to your neighbors and see if they're composting. So yeah, there's just some different options. So we're gonna wrap this up and we're gonna take some questions.
Thank you, Lexi and Amanda. So we have one question already, and the question is, what do people do with extra carbon/leaves if they can't take it somewhere?
Oh, did you want me to answer that, Amanda?
I don't know, I didn't hear it, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
would you like me to repeat it?
Yeah, could you?
Yeah, so the question is, what do people do with extra carbons/leaves if they can't take them somewhere?
A lot of times you can just kind of, actually, if you have enough backyard space, if you have leaves, they're going to break down in your lawn. If you just leave them in a pile, you know, where you're not really going to pay attention to them, they will eventually break down. It's like Lexi said with the forest, over time they break down. So that's a good way to manage your leaf and yard waste if you can't bring it somewhere, or if you can't use like the dried leaves in your compost bin or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it will break down over time. And then you could always like ask your neighbor, even if you don't have a drop-off station. Anyone who gardens, I've seen people that have made like leaf mulch, and in their garden bed in the fall, whenever they collect their leaves, they'll kind of spread a couple inch layer over a garden bed, and those leaves will break down and help enrich the soil too.
Great, thank you both. I don't see any other questions, but we'll give it a few minutes if folks want to think up some questions to put in the chat.
Okay.
Not a question, but a compliment, saying very helpful, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Very busy.
So we have a question that says, what is hardware cloth?
So it's essentially a wire mesh. You can buy it at like pretty much any hardware store that you could go to, like, you know, like a Lowe's or a Home Depot or a gardening store. And essentially it's just a different word for a wire mesh. It's a little cross pattern. And they come in different sizes. Yeah, you want to add anything on that, Lexi?
Yeah, I think that you can even like cut some of them to size. I think you can cut it to size depending on your bin, and you can put that around your bin like we saw in the photo, or you can put it under a bin if you choose to have a bin as well. And then if you choose to have a green cone, if you decide that that's a good option for you, you can wrap the basket that goes into the ground in hardware cloth. So it seems to work really, really well. I don't have a backyard bin myself, but it seems to work really well for people who do have backyard bins in terms of keeping animals out.
Yeah, and we also, when people buy green cones from us, we tell people to actually put it under the sod around the perimeter of their green cone, kind of like a skirt, just flat on the ground, and then put the sod over the top, and that'll kind of prevent animals from digging down into your basket.
That's a great segue into the next question, which is there a place locally to get the green cones?
So there's a lot of different options. They can be kind of difficult to get sometimes because they have become so popular. Like I know in our solid waste management district, we just started selling them again. A lot of times you can ask if you have a solid waste management district near you. You know, if you are in Vermont, sometimes they will sell them at kind of a lower rate because they can buy them in bulk. You can buy them online. There's a lot of options there, but sometimes they are out of stock. So just be aware of that. Yeah, but I think without the kind of lower class through like buying it in bulk, it's like around $200. So they are quite expensive.
Yeah, and it depends where locally they're speaking of. I'm not sure where they're located.
Mhm.
Great. So the next question is, do you have to keep compost away from old wood buildings due to heat?
So I'm not totally sure. Compost is pretty, like, I know that it's volatile. It can catch on fire. I've never seen compost catch on fire. I don't think that that's likely, but I mean, it can get to like 160. I've seen piles get to 170 and they steam a lot, but I mean, as long as you don't put it right next to the building, you should be fine. Do not quote me on that. I don't know where you're planning on putting your pile, especially if it's a backyard bin. Like I said, your pile is not going to get really hot. It's not going to get to 160. It might plateau at 140. So just keep that in mind whenever you're placing it in your backyard.
Yeah, you also like pretty much whatever situation, you might still want to keep your compost pile a couple feet away from your house to at least. I think we normally say at least 4 feet. So
Okay, so the next question is, with the green cones, do you know if there are certain kind of regulation standards that one should look for as far as leaching concerns, especially in well-water based suburban areas?
I don't believe they really leach that much, especially if you're like managing them correctly. I wouldn't imagine it would be a problem that would really have any sort of regulation towards it. But I'm not entirely certain. Do you know, Lexi, anything about that?
I mean, from my knowledge, I've never really gotten any complaints about leaching from a green cone. I've never seen a green cone leach too much.
Yeah, it should be going right into the soil. So
Yeah, the soil should absorb it and retain that moisture without it leaching up onto the surface. So
Wonderful. So the next question is, can you put green weeds and vines in a compost bin? Would blackberry vines break down?
do you want me to take this one, Amanda?
sure.
So you can put leaves and vines into a compost pile. We do have a bit of a concern with something called persistent herbicides, depending on where you're getting the vines from, with mostly like it'll affect broadleaf plants. So if you're using any plant or cutting or leaf that could have had some type of herbicide put on it, it's important to just be careful that and know that if you put that compost on your plants, it might affect it. There's a small chance of it having persistent herbicides, but it's going to break down in your compost pile. As long as that isn't a concern for you, you can throw them in there.
Yeah, along those same lines, we also tell people not to really put florist flowers, like the flowers they're going to get from the florist, in their compost pile because of the different herbicides and chemicals that they use on them. So that's an important thing to note as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to that, because I work in invasive plant management, if you're going to add any invasive plants or weeds from your property into your compost, you just want to be mindful that it is reaching a high enough temperature to sterilize the seeds, because otherwise you may inadvertently be spreading the seeds of the invasive plants that you put in there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Amanda, Lexi, and I will stay on just a little bit more if any questions pop up. But thank you, Amanda and Lexi, for a really wonderful presentation on composting today. And thank you all for attending today. This is the last edition of our Winter Working Woodlands webinar series. So as long as when you filled out the form, the registration form, you said yes to being in contact about future workshops, I'll be reaching out about the plans for the upcoming season, which I'm really excited to share once they get finalized. So we'll be going on a brief hiatus until May, and then the next workshops will be kicking off again. So for those who have been tuning in for most of the winter series, thank you very much. I hope that these workshops have given you something to look forward to during this very difficult winter. So thanks again, and Amanda and Lexi and I will stay on for just a few more minutes for any last minute questions, and I'll be sending out the recording to the email you received the link once that recording is uploaded. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you guys again so much. Really, this was a wonderful collaboration.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was fun.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yep.
So have a great rest of your week, guys. I'm going to end the
All right.
meeting now.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.